In this video, we've come to the Brecon Beacons in Wales to talk about camera settings for landscape photography. We're going to be running through how to control exposure, also how to focus correctly, and one or two tips on the best way to set up your camera. So the first thing to talk about is exposure. Now there's a few ways of monitoring exposure. Firstly, you can use the meter that's built into your camera, and you can see this usually through your viewfinder, on your back screen, or if you've got a screen on the top of your camera, it'll appear there too. And it looks a lot like this. And essentially, there'll be a little arrow that will tell you whether your image is overexposed or underexposed. So if it's underexposed, the arrow will appear to the left, whereas if it's overexposed, it'll appear to the right. And when your exposure is about right, it'll be positioned in the middle. Now this is a really good way of getting a quick indication of whether your exposure is correct or not. You can correct your exposure in post-processing very easily, however it's always best to get it right in camera first, especially as when you start messing around too much with it in post-processing, you can start introducing noise into your image, so it's best to get that correct in camera if possible. The second way to monitor your exposure, and I'd highly recommend that you try using this method, is to use the histogram function that many cameras have. Now the histogram will overlay the image on the back of your camera when you're in live view, and essentially what it does is it indicates the distribution of tones in your image. This is often better than using the basic meter because it's taking a reading from the whole of your image. If your image is too dark, the histogram will be skewed towards the left. If it's too bright, then it'll be skewed towards the right. Now there are times when you will want to purposefully over or underexpose your image, and also in most situations you won't necessarily have an even distribution in the histogram. However, what it is very useful for is showing you if you're clipping your darks or clipping your highlights, and that's something to be avoided because those can't be rescued so easily in post-processing. Now to control exposure, there are three main settings to consider. The first is ISO, the second is aperture, and the third is shutter speed. And together those three settings make up what is often referred to as the exposure triangle. And they'll each interact with each other. So for instance, if you increase your aperture, you might want to decrease your shutter speed, or vice versa. The first setting to talk about is ISO. Now for landscape photography, it's fairly straightforward. You will want to use a fairly low ISO. So ISO refers to the sensitivity of your camera's sensor. If you want your sensor to be more sensitive to light, you'll need to go for a higher ISO, whereas if you go for a lower ISO, it's less sensitive to light. So in darker conditions, you might want to go for a higher ISO. However, generally in landscape photography, because our subjects aren't moving and we're using a tripod, we can get away with using lower ISOs. And normally, we'll tend to use ISOs of around about 100, maybe 200, and we very rarely need to go any higher than that. Once you start getting higher in ISO, you start to introduce the risk of noise into your images. Particularly higher ISOs like 1000 can often introduce more noise. Now a lot of modern cameras allow you to push the ISO quite high, but generally for landscape photography you want to keep the ISO low. The second setting to talk about is aperture. So the aperture is essentially a measurement of the size of the opening of the iris in your lens. A smaller aperture will allow less light to reach the sensor, and a larger aperture will allow more light to reach the sensor. However, crucially, the aperture also controls depth of field. Now what I mean by depth of field is the region of your photo that's going to be in focus. So if you're doing something like portrait photography or wildlife photography, you might want to opt for a larger aperture, and this will decrease your depth of field, enabling you to render your background and foreground out of focus, and we call this effect bokeh. However, for landscape photography, we normally want to maximize our depth of field. Something along the lines of f13 or f16 is normally ideal. So once we've set the ISO and the aperture, the next way to control the exposure is by using shutter speed. And generally, the most important things to control will be your ISO, which will have it around about 100. Your aperture will be f13 to f16, which means that your shutter speed is then used to dictate your overall exposure. However, there are times when you might want to slow down your shutter speed even further. So for instance, when we're taking a photo of a waterfall like we're doing now, and you want to get that silken effect in the water, you'll use a longer shutter speed of a few seconds. And if you aren't able to do that without overexposing your image, that's when we use filters such as the ND filter, which will allow us to increase our exposure even longer. So the next thing to talk about is focusing. And in landscape photography, we generally want to have a sharp image from the foreground all the way through to the background. So we want to maximize our depth of field. Now, as I mentioned, aperture is going to be one factor that affects depth of field, and you want to be using a smaller aperture in order to maximize that. However, you also want to consider the point at which you focus. So when you focus an image at one particular point, the depth of field will normally extend for 1/3 towards you from that focus point and 2/3 away from you. So by setting your focus point to about 1/3 into your image, you can help to maximize that depth of field. Another way of maximizing your depth of field is to use what we call hyperfocal distance. Now this effectively is working along the same principle as focusing 1/3 into your image, however it's going a little bit more technical. And there are apps you can download or charts that you can use to give you the precise hyperfocal distance. However, practically, to be honest, I normally find that focusing about 1/3 into your scene is sufficient. I tend not to walk around with a tape measure to go and measure distances, and I can't measure distances visually very well at all. So normally just by focusing about 1/3 into your scene is a good enough way of maximizing your depth of field. In order to do that, what I'll normally do is position the focal point that I'm using about 1/3 into the scene. I'll focus the camera using the autofocus, and then I'll switch the lens back into manual focus mode to ensure that the focal point then doesn't change again. Another option that you can opt for is using the back button focus. I won't go into the details of that now because it's different for every camera. Essentially what you can do is, rather than having your autofocus function set to your shutter release button, you can set it to a button on the back of your camera, which you can then use to focus the scene. And that will save you having to switch your lens from the autofocus into the manual mode. So there are a few other settings to consider when doing landscape photography. First of all, your shooting mode, and I'd always recommend that you shoot in manual mode because this gives you the most control over your exposure. However, when you're first starting out, it can seem a little bit daunting to have your camera in manual mode. So another mode that you might want to consider is aperture priority. Now, using aperture priority, you can set your ISO and you can set your aperture, which are the main two things that we want to have fixed when doing landscapes, but your shutter speed will then alter automatically. However, I would highly recommend jumping into manual mode and giving it a go, because by using the histogram or the exposure meter, you'll find that it's actually really quick to learn how to use the camera effectively in manual mode, and this will give you a much greater control over your overall exposure. Another thing that you might want to consider doing is bracketing your images. So when you're doing post-processing, what you'll often find is that your sky or highlights in your sky are blown out, or your darks are too dark. And by bracketing exposures, what we essentially do is we take 3 images. We'll take the first one at a normal exposure, we'll then drop the exposure down 1 stop, take another image, and then we can take a final image where we've increased the exposure by 1 stop. And by doing this, we can then blend those photos together in Photoshop later, and that will give us a much more natural looking image. Now, there are a few other important settings to consider when taking landscape photos. The first is the file type that your camera saves when you're taking images. Now, you'll find that many cameras out of the box will be automatically set up to take JPEGs, and I'd highly recommend that you change your camera so that they shoot RAW. Now, when your camera shoots in JPEG, it's a compressed file type, and your camera is essentially making many of the creative decisions for you in how it's taking the image. So it's always best to shoot in RAW. When you're shooting RAW, the file size will be much bigger, but there's more information about each of those images is stored within those files. So this allows you to make adjustments afterwards in post-processing that you generally can't do with JPEGs. Now, in the equipment video, I mentioned using a shutter release, and a shutter release is really useful for doing landscape photography. Essentially, it enables you to take the photo without touching the camera, and therefore you don't get camera shake. So it's a good idea to use a shutter release, and if you're not using a shutter release, another option is to use a 2-second delay, which means that when the photo is actually taken, you're not touching the camera, and this helps to eliminate camera shake. So that pretty much covers it for settings for landscape photography. I hope you found this video useful. We'll have more tutorials coming up soon, so remember to subscribe, please click like, and we'll see you soon. Take care.